Well, thank you, Maurice, for those kind words. I also thank the entire staff of the DeKalb History Center for hosting tonight's event. And I likewise thank all of you for coming out this afternoon in this heat wave. I hope you're all staying cool somehow. I likewise thank all of you for your interest in my latest book, Odyssey, Young Charles Darwin, The Beagle and The Voyage That Changed the World. About 5 years ago, in what now seems like about 5 minutes before COVID shut down the world, I just published my book, Revolutionary Brothers, which chronicles the friendship shared by Thomas Jefferson and the Marquis de Lafayette. Like Charles Darwin, who idolized the Prussian explorer Alexander von Humboldt, Jefferson was another Humboldt admirer. As president, he even hosted the explorer at the White House several times in 1804. And beyond that, the explorer of the American West, John Fremont, and the subject of my 2002 biography, Pathfinder, likewise idolized Humboldt, and after the Prussians' death in 1859, he even purchased part of Humboldt's personal library. So three books on Humboldt from three Humboldt devotees. You think maybe there's a pattern emerging here. So tonight I want to talk to you about Odyssey, my book on Darwin, otherwise known around my house as my pandemic lockdown project. Charles Darwin lived from 1802 to 1882. He first saw the light of day in the small town of Shrewsbury, England, where he was born on February 12, 1809. That same day, thousands of miles to the west, in a rough-hewn log cabin in Kentucky, the infant Abraham Lincoln also first saw the light of day. Of the circumstances associated with the two men's respective births, however, those attending Darwin's could not have been more different than those of Lincoln's humble origins. Charles Darwin was the fifth of 6 children born to physician and investor Robert Waring Darwin and his wife, Savannah, daughter of industrial ceramics magnate Josiah Wedgwood. Shrewsbury lies in Shropshire, the county of Shropshire, then and today a landlocked, largely rural county in England's West Midlands. In Shrewsbury, Robert Darwin prospered through a medical practice that served prominent families in the area. Prudent investments augmented his wealth, local rental properties, and stocks in railroads and canals. Charles's mother, Susanna, a cultured woman whose piano teachers included Frederick Chopin, died when he was 8 years old. Afterwards, he grew up in a household run by a matriarchy composed of his 3 older teenage sisters. Charles grew up with insatiable curiosity concerning the rural natural world that surrounded him. Indeed, during those years, he compulsively collected, among other items, birds' eggs, insects, postage stamps, and rocks. However, in the local private boarding school that he attended, and later at Edinburgh and Cambridge universities, he proved himself an indifferent student. By now, in popular imagination, as in this photograph of the scientist taken 4 years before his death, the face of Charles Darwin comes to us wizened with lines of age and framed by the Old Testament prophet's beard by which the world in 1859 first came to know him. That was the year when, at the age of 50, he published his groundbreaking book on the origin of species. To be sure, we have scores of contemporary portraits of the scientists from that era and later, many of them photographs. By contrast, we have but 2 portraits of Charles, neither of them photographs rendered before his 30th year. But despite that shortage of youthful portraits, without Darwin's travels between 1831 and 1836 aboard HMS Beagle, he likely would never have written The Origin of Species, again published in 1859. According to popular lore, Sailing aboard the Beagle, Darwin visited the Pacific Ocean's remote Galapagos Islands. There, he noticed some interesting tortoises and birds, and voila, then and there, his soon famous theory burst into his head, after which he returned to England and promptly, in a white-hot fury, wrote Origin of Species. As Darwin himself put it in his posthumously published autobiography, The Voyage of the Beagle, quote, "The voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career." In that autobiography, written in Darwin's later years and published posthumously, he reflected on the qualities that enabled his success as a scientist. "I think that I am superior to the common run of men in noticing things which easily escape attention and in observing them carefully. My industry has been nearly as great as it could have been in the observation and collection of facts. From my early youth, I have had the strongest desire to understand or explain whatever I observed, that is, to group all facts under some general laws. Those causes combined have given me the patience to reflect or ponder for any number of years over any unexplained problem. Even so, as the poet Homer observes in the Odyssey, quote, "The gods don't hand out all their gifts at once." In his autobiography, Darwin also assessed the price he paid for the intellectual attainments of his later years, a price that included the loss of the artistic pleasures of his youth. "My mind has changed," quote, "my mind has changed during the last 20 or 30 years, he lamented. Quote, "Up to the age of 30 or beyond it, poetry of many kinds, such as the works of Milton, Gray, Byron, Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley, gave me great pleasure." Close quote. "Moreover," he added, "I have almost lost my taste for pictures or music. Music, formerly a source of great pleasure, generally sets me thinking too energetically on what I have been at work on instead of giving me pleasure. Indeed, as I conducted research for my own book and discovered these often sharp demarcations between Darwin's youth and his later years, I realized that they've led to a host of misconceptions concerning his life and works. And for this evening's present purposes, I've distilled some of those conceptions into a list of 5. Let's begin with the one that heads my list. Misconception number 1, that the Beagle was dispatched to the Galapagos on a scientific expedition. While Darwin's Beagle travels did shape his career as a scientist, the purposes of that expedition were in truth primarily commercial, economic, and political, and only inadvertently scientific. The Beagle's now famous 5-week call in the Galapagos, for instance, belonged to a 5-year global British Navy surveying expedition. More specifically, the Beagle had been commissioned to conduct marine surveys of selected coastlines and ports around the world, but mainly in South America. Britain during those years was competing with various European states as well as the United States for increased trade with Portugal's and Spain's former colonies, by then newly independent nations. And for British officials, that competition demanded updated maps of those and other waters, nautical charts whose production required fresh marine surveys. Misconception number 2, Darwin served aboard the Beagle as the ship's official naturalist. It's true that Darwin, by the conclusion of the Beagle's voyage, was informally recognized as the ship's naturalist. In truth, however, he played no formal role aboard the Beagle, nor in its survey work. When the Beagle departed England, Darwin was a 22-year-old aspiring but unknown naturalist, and at that, one who hoped to make his name as a geologist, not as a biologist. Darwin's invitation to accompany the voyage came from the ship's captain, Robert Fitzroy, who had served on an earlier global survey involving the Beagle and another ship. During that voyage, the Beagle's original commander, overcome during an anchorage at Terra del Fuego, had locked himself in his cabin and put a bullet in his head. For Fitzroy, who ultimately replaced the deceased commander and who himself was subject to depression with a recent suicide in his own family, the late captain's death served as a cautionary tale. Thus, soon after learning that he was to command a second expedition to many of the same destinations, Fitzroy, to relieve the isolation that otherwise would accompany that command, struck upon an idea. Why not invite a civilian to accompany the voyage, someone outside the ship's chain of command with whom he might share his dinner table? Even better, find one who shared his interests in natural history. Such regular company and conversation, Fitzroy reasoned, might lessen his own odds of replicating his predecessor's downward spiral. Misconception number 3. The author of Voyage of the Beagle spent most of those 5 years of travels at sea. Well, in Darwin's case, to call his 5 years of Beagle-associated travel a voyage is misleading. In the end, he actually spent 3/5 of those 5 years of travels on land, 3 years and 3 months on land versus a total of 535 days on water. How was that, you might ask? Well, as an aspiring naturalist and determined to maximize opportunities to collect natural specimens, Darwin accompanied the survey expedition with the understanding that he would be allowed to leave the ship at will. Typically, his overland travels, conducted with hireling but local guides after arranging to meet the Beagle at another port, lasted days, weeks, or even months. So why, if Darwin spent most of his time on land during those years, did he entitle his account of it The Voyage of the Beagle? The simple answer is he didn't. Darwin's account of his Beagle travels, originally published in 1839 under the bland title Journal and Remarks, belonged to a 3-volume quasi-official account of the, by then, 2 global survey expeditions with which the Beagle had been associated. Not until 1905, decades after its author's death, did the big book appear under the title by which later readers came to cherish it, The Voyage of the Beagle. As a side note, if I may digress, Darwin's contribution to the multi-volume Beagle publication project, his volume now known as Voyage of the Beagle, drew on a lively diary that he kept during his travels. Compelling writing fills many of Voyage of the Beagle's pages. Even so, for reasons of concision and content, about half of his diary's words failed to make it into the published book. Most particularly, Darwin excluded many non-survey related topics, personal tribulations, and materials that Captain Fitzroy, who oversaw the project, might deem irrelevant, frivolous, offensive, or proprietary reasons wanted to rope off for himself to describe. Typifying that deference was Darwin's treatment of a noteworthy anchorage in Tierra del Fuego, where the ship repatriated 3 natives of the area. The 3 had been inadvertently kidnapped during the ship's first expedition and taken to England for instruction in Anglican Christianity and the claimed virtues of English civilization. The repatriation of the natives and their interactions with other natives, as Darwin makes clear in his diary and letters, fascinated as much as anything he witnessed during the entire voyage, including the Galapagos. But in deference to Fitzroy, in Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin declined to describe the episode or to express his thoughts concerning what he had witnessed. We stayed there for 5 days, Darwin wrote in Voyage of the Beagle. Captain Fitzroy has given an account of all the interesting events which there happened. As Oscar Hammerstein might say, it's good to be the captain. Additionally, in Voyage of the Beagle, because the ship made repeated visits to several anchorages, Darwin strayed from his diary's chronological structure to organize Voyage of the Beagle's chapters by place. In the end, those and other editorial decisions, in my view, sacrificed much of his diary's drama, narrative cohesion, candor, topical breadth, and intimacy, the latter what Darwin called the chit-chat details of my journal. In creating my own narrative of Darwin's travels, I elected to tap into the full breadth of his writings, both published and unpublished. Moreover, in depicting events associated with his Beagle travels, I decided early on in my research to accord primacy not to Voyage of the Beagle, but to writings created during his travels. His diary, field notes, and letters. Typically those letters, colorful and robustly detailed, and often crackling with an immediacy unfound in Voyage of the Beagle, were sent to family members and friends. For further illumination, I also drew on the correspondence, memoirs, and diaries of others he encountered or traveled with during those years. Indeed, in drawing on the full breadth of Darwin's writings during those years, I discovered a spirit possessed of an energy and imagination that I did not expect to find. Moreover, I happily found that spirit not dissimilar to that which animate the best works of such writers as Lord Byron, Jules Verne, and Mary Shelley, and for that matter, even Homer and Jack Kerouac. To wit, his expected interest in science and nature, myriad other topics enlivened Darwin's Beagle writings, including politics, missionaries, fashion, colonialism, race, slavery, architecture, women, South American and Australian cities, history, Tahitian royalty, gauchos, the British Empire, indigenous people, shopping, and cuisine. Moreover, his dispatch of those and other unexpected topics, in my view, showcase his often underestimated gifts as a writer. Now, to return to our parade of misconceptions. Misconception number 4. Throughout his life, as the quintessential Victorian scientist, Darwin was bookish, reclusive, and singularly focused. Well, in 1839, a few years after his return, Charles married his first cousin, the former Emma Wedgwood. She was 30, he was 29. And over the coming years, they had 10 children, 7 of whom lived into adulthood. And during his middle and later years, Charles was often beset with illnesses. And those circumstances, growing family responsibilities, and poor health kept him close to home. Indeed, after his return from his Beagle travels, he never again set foot outside of Britain. However, during his earlier years, including those of his Beagle travels, Charles was tall, lean, and fit. Moreover, he had diverse interests and exemplified robust health. Impressively, between 1831 and 1836, at visited ports or places passed on overland outings, Darwin, then in his 20s, relished spending a few hours or an entire day climbing each area's highest mountain, whether in Brazil, Argentina, Tierra del Fuego, Uruguay, Chile, the Galapagos, Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, or Tasmania. Beyond that, thanks to years of experience with firearms and mounted hunting excursions in England, he impressed even Argentina's gauchos with his marksmanship and he savored extended journeys on horseback over often difficult terrain, even dangerous terrains, including mountains, plains, jungles, and even South America's Atacama Desert. Misconception number 5. The Galapagos produced the eureka moment when Darwin first conjured his theory of evolution. Well, that's a good story, and as Hemingway might say, it would be pretty to think so. But truth be known, for Darwin, his now storied 5 weeks on the Galapagos produced no eureka moment. In fact, he embarked on and returned from the voyage as a creationist, his term. His belief in what he later called the, quote, fixity of species remained intact. More to the point, only after Darwin's return from his Beagle travels, and only after others had inspected the specimens he collected in the Galapagos, did he appreciate the island species variance among the birds and tortoises he had gathered there. Indeed, while Darwin had nursed lifelong interest in natural history, his Cambridge degree, completed mere months before his departure aboard the Beagle, was the sort obtained by young men preparing for the Anglican ministry, the very vocation he had planned to pursue upon his return to England. Furthermore, after returning to England in 1836, he did not publish The Origin species until 23 years later. Now, because the Galapagos are by now so widely viewed as the hallowed site where Darwin first conceived his theory of evolution, I want to conclude by saying a few more things about his time there. As I noted earlier, the Beagle spent just 5 weeks in the Galapagos, 5 weeks out of 5 years of global travel, 4 years of which were spent in South America. From the journal and field notes that Darwin kept and his letters home, we know that he was impressed with the Galapagos, not only with its flora and fauna, but equally so with its myriad dormant volcanoes. Remember, he was mostly interested in geology in those days. But in truth, he saw nothing earth-shattering about the islands. For instance, none of his writings from the voyage even make mention of the famous group of avian species now called Darwin's finches, whose differing beaks would bolster his later theory of evolution. Indeed, his coverage of his Galapagos visit contains only one reference, and at that, a passing reference to any sort of finch. But if Darwin didn't write about the finches while he was in the Galapagos, he certainly collected them there, shooting and preparing finch specimens that he sent to England. But in a lapse from his usual attention to detail, and one that shows how little attention he was paying to island diversity, after shooting them, he commingled the birds, failing to record on their labels the specific islands on which each had been killed. Indeed, not until 1837 in London, after the expedition's return and the bird's inspection by zoologist John Gould, did Darwin come to recognize the variants among the finches. Similarly, although Darwin noted and recorded the behavior of the massive tortoises on the islands, he failed to notice the differences among them until the Galapagos' governor brought them to his attention. And as with the birds, there was another scientist, the French herpetologist Gabriel Bibon, who had studied specimens from earlier Galapagos expeditions, who confirmed for Darwin their variances. Late in life, Darwin was asked whether he had been an evolutionist during his Beagle travels. His answer, quote, "I believed in the permanence of species. As far as I can remember, vague doubts occasionally flitted across my mind, but I did not become convinced that species were mutable until 2 or 3 years had elapsed." So, how then did the Galapagos become synonymous with Darwin's theoretical leap? Well, it just so happens that John Van Wy, a talented Cambridge-trained historian of science, now at the University of Singapore, recently traced the linkage. Initially, and for 50 years after Darwin's death in 1882, Van Wy observed, quote, "Most accounts of the origins of Darwin's theory attribute no particular significance to his visit there as compared to South America. Over time, however, the fact that Darwin's theory had eventually made significant use of Galapagos evidence morphed into a eureka moment. By Van Wy's account, in the early 20th century, about a quarter of publications referencing Darwin had him discovering evolution while he was in the Galapagos. Then, in 1935, the centennial of the Beagle's Galapagos visit, a group sailing from San Francisco and calling itself the Darwin Memorial Expedition added to the linkage. During a 2-year voyage, the party's members unveiled a monument on the Galapagos where Darwin first went ashore. The inscription read, in part, quote, "Charles Darwin landed on the Galapagos Islands in 1835, and his studies thereon led him for the first time to consider the problem of organic evolution. Thus was started that revolution in thought on this subject, which has since taken place." Later that year, again, we're in 1935, a conference of British scientists ratified the connection and devoted an entire session to papers on the, quote, "centenary of the landing of Darwin on the Galapagos Islands and of the birth of the hypothesis of the origin of species." As Van Wy writes, now for the first time, Darwin was widely represented as discovering evolution on the Galapagos. The title of this session alone was reproduced in newspapers and journals throughout the world. By now, 200 years after Darwin set sail on the Beagle, the notion that the Galapagos chain is literally the birthplace of the theory of evolution is commonplace. Among scientists and other intellectual pioneers, however, such breakthroughs rarely arrive as blinding revelations. Instead, they tend to emerge from plodding, cumulative, laborious work, trial and error, even happenstance. And thus for Darwin, there was no revelation in the Galapagos, no epiphany among the tortoises and finches there. Much like the island's inhabitants, the scientists had to evolve. Thank you very much. Thank you. I published a book maybe 3 years ago, and which means I